And that brings us to the second point here, because Ben brings that up and everybody, blah, 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 whatever. Stephen A. Smith of ESPN, obviously, said on First Take, he was talking about Ben Roethlisberger. He said, quote, "Your hands ain't clean in all of this." And I had to say that with a little emphasis because we all know Stephen A. was screaming into the microphone when he said that. "Aren't you somewhat responsible for transitioning as it pertains to culture, particularly when Mike Tomlin was there and you're there? You stayed too long. Last 3 years in the league, Ben Roethlisberger should have been gone. He was a statue. I'm just saying, if you're big Ben Roethlisberger, I thought you stayed a couple of years too long, and I thought you sort of curtailed and stymied the transition.
Stymied.
Thank you. The transition. So the era would continue offensively. I'm talking about. I don't think he did enough. I thought he stayed around too long, and I didn't think that was a person that should have been around." That is a huge question, huge topic of conversation, because I don't think that has anything to do with the culture, but it has everything to do with what we're talking about. Is Ben some of the blame here for why the Pittsburgh Steelers are where they are? Because let's be honest. The year before Ben retires, Jalen Hurts is drafted 3 picks after they select Chase Claypool. Ben says he's coming back. Cool. The year Ben retires, I mean, you could have drafted me, okay, in that quarterback class. You could have said Noah Strackbine, and people would have been like, "I don't know who that is," but chances are he's just as good as Desmond Ridder. It is what it is. That's how bad the quarterback class was. You look 2 years of before that, I believe that was the Joe Burrow year, I want to say. And you have all of those great quarterbacks. You have all of those talented classes. The Steelers waited until the worst possible one. Nick, you putting this blame on Ben Roethlisberger a little bit, or are you saying, and I mean, I'm going to ask this question, but you also have to take into account that the last time a quarterback came in here and was supposed to be the understudy of Ben Roethlisberger said, "Screw you, man. I'm not helping you. In fact, I'm going to ruin your career." And he did a great job at doing it. But Ben was not a guy that was going to stick around and coach a quarterback, and he was going to ruin that guy, no matter who it was. Do you put some blame on Ben?
I think the fact that like Ben Roethlisberger just kind of like played a little bit of like, oh, will he, come back or not?
Yes.
And like it was after the elbow injury was when everyone should have been like sounding alarms, like, okay, they need to address this like now. And they waited till he officially retired to like do that. And I think the reason why that was because in 2018 they go and Kevin Colbert follows up one of his best drafts in 2017, where he got TJ Watt, Juju Smith-Schuster, James Conner, Cam Sutton, all good players. And then they decide, oh yeah, we're going to take Mason Rudolph in the 3rd round because according to like, sources at the time, they said, oh, they had a 1st round grade on him. And I am losing my damn mind when I was reading that. And I was like, so we passed on Lamar Jackson in the 1st round because you had Mason Rudolph with a high grade. Like, we didn't think to draft a linebacker in that draft after Ryan Shazier got hurt because, we wanted to draft James Washington. Like, I'm sorry, but like the criticisms of Roethlisberger, I understand them, but it's not where this team failed. It's the up and down drafts of the Kevin Colbert, Mike Tomlin regime, where they like the 2017 draft, it pulled them out of the gutter of what they could do, and it pulled them to the top of the AFC. And then the 2018 draft was the failure to make the transition smooth. And then that's why the end of the Roethlisberger regime was just so up and down. And like, obviously Matt Canada had a play in that one as well. It's that type of stuff that is the reason why this team is where it is. It's not, Roethlisberger had a hand in the culture and all this. And I'm just like, I don't see that as the reason. I just draft good football players and your team will be fine. They didn't draft good football players. They waited until 2022, the worst quarterback draft since 2013. I tried talking myself into one of those guys, obviously, but it's like, I knew it wasn't a strong quarterback class. I knew it was not 2021. I knew it wasn't 2020. It wasn't one of those classes that you could hang your hat on. And they were just so confident drafting a guy and saying, this is our franchise. And I'm just like, lose me with it. Lose me with it. I'm sorry. Like,
lose me with it, he goes. I agree. Steven, as somebody who, you grew up watching the transition of one team, of one great quarterback into a crappy quarterback situation. And you got it bad, man. You had Cam Newton for a season. You then started covering a team who was in the midst of another transition. Do you ever put that on the quarterback, or do you agree with Nick here? Does it sometimes you're just like, what the hell, man? Why did it take until he left for that to happen? And to Nick's point, and I'll get to this in a second, but to Nick's point, what they did in it, like they used Ben as an excuse not to draft a quarterback. I don't think they had an excuse not to draft anybody else who was talented in the 3 years outside of a quarterback. Like they brought the worst draft classes of all time. And I think that Devin Bush wasn't the best example because I think the ACL kind of threw him off there. But it was just a bad situation for the Pittsburgh Steelers. You watch that transition for both teams now. Do you agree with Nick here? Is it on the franchise to say, who cares what the quarterback has to say? We have to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I read Stephen A's comments and I was all about, like, it seemed a little unfair to Ben. First of all, like, you can't expect a player like that to just kind of voluntarily give up his spot as starting quarterback. I think it was either you or Nick who made a good point about Ben, kind of being half in, half out as he kind of went through that transition, deciding, if he was going to come back or not. But it's on the franchise to make the best decisions for their football team. Like,
yep.
I don't know, you should not be at the whim of your players. Like, that's not smart team building. That's not smart roster management. You have to make the decisions for yourself. And then, like, I agree with Nick too. Like, you left the cupboard entirely bare because you were trying so desperately to win while Ben was still in town and while he was still playing football, that I think you kind of sacrificed the future a little bit. Like, you didn't look enough at, okay, well, we have these holes and we're really young this way. Like, we need to think long-term because there is a future after Ben. I think they were kind of just trying to squeeze as much as they could out of the end of the Ben Roethlisberger era, that it cost them down the road. And now you're paying for it. Now the timing's all off. And now you just have different portions of this team that are at different stages in their development as players. And on top of that, you have some holes in your roster in terms of talent that you just can't overcome, no matter like what the culture was like, no matter how, involved Ben was in, getting Mason Rudolph ready for a starting job or anything like that. Like, there are very foundational things about this team that are wrong, that go beyond Ben Roethlisberger. Even if he has to share some of the blame, it's definitely not as much as I think some people, like Stephen A. Smith, want to put on him.
Yeah.
I want to add real quick with, we saw a successful succession plan put in place by the Packers recently. True. With their drafting of Jordan Love. And like at the time, it was like, you piss off Aaron Rodgers, it wasn't a good thing, but they were thinking like 20 steps ahead because they understood that trying to get the most out of Aaron Rodgers, like it was a plan with a limited time frame. They wanted something that would expand further. And I think we see, you want to talk about tradition. I mean, they went from a successful Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers to potentially Jordan Love. Like, they had that plan. They had that plan in mind. Pittsburgh did not. They were trying to get as most out of Roethlisberger to the point it was basically zombification.
It's true. And you mentioned team. I mean, you said Lamar Jackson earlier. I mean, think about them. Joe Flacco was at the end of his career, but like wasn't at the end of his career. And they just took Lamar Jackson because they said, this is a good quarterback. Why would we not? And then here it is. And you got to think, and Nick, I'll toss this one to you because You brought up the 2018 draft. You brought up Lamar Jackson. I mean, it still haunts me to this day. I still could picture it so vividly. Mike Tomlin sitting around saying, "Oh, well, as you guys know, we were in the market for a safety in that draft." And he said that a dozen times since that draft class. Steven, you weren't here for this. You want to know who that safety was? That first round safety was? His name is Terrell Edmonds, okay? And he plays for the Tennessee Titans right now. Meanwhile, Lamar Jackson, who was drafted after him, is an MVP, winning the AFC North right now. You want to talk about a bad offense? The Baltimore Ravens offense is terrible, but they have this guy named Lamar Jackson who's pretty damn good and able to make it a very good offense. I mean, Nick, you look at this, okay? Just think about this as a whole, okay? As an entire, and on top of that, Morgan Burnett was in town. The Steelers didn't plan to start Terrell Edmonds. That wasn't their idea. Their idea was to have Terrell Edmonds grow into something with Sean Davis, who's another terrible example all in its own. You look at this, Nick. You look at this, and you just say, just to bring it full circle here. I mean, is it just time to admit that for the last 5+ years, the Pittsburgh Steelers have just done nothing to build a good organization, and at this point, it has come back and it's boiling over. You know what I mean? They've taken steps, they've made moves. I think in the last 2 years, I think Omar Khan has a lot to do with that. But they have taken steps in the last 2 years to start to rebuild what they were. But for everybody trying to blame Ben, for everybody trying to blame, this or that, I think it's time, and maybe I'm wrong here, to just acknowledge that up until really last offseason, the Pittsburgh Steelers failed miserably to try and build an organization outside of a few pieces here and there. Minka was a great move, obviously. TJ Watt that draft doesn't even count, but every year after that draft, and even the years before that draft, were pretty rough. But you got a couple of outliers. But in the grand scheme of things, this is just a buildup of really, really bad moves, really, really bad drafts, all coming back to bite a team in the butt. And, maybe it's finally time. And last year was probably time where it hits a breaking point. And that happens to everybody.
I mean, for me, 2018 was that breaking point. I saw that draft and I saw the writing on the wall. I said at the time, I thought this was the most crucial draft that they had to nail, and they didn't nail it. And it was one that came back to haunt them. Lamar Jackson is one of those guys that, obviously he was like my QB4, so it's not like I had him super high, but I still had him 14th on my board. I still understood he was a guy I would want to take a chance on, and the fact that they just glossed over it really irks me to this day. Oh, let's not even talk about the fact of Fred Warner could have been a great succession plan to the Ryan Shazier tragedy.
Dude, Shaq Leonard was up there as well. Shaq Leonard was right there as well. You got to, just for those who don't remember, and Steven doesn't know this, so he might laugh when we say this out loud. This is the Steelers' top 3 picks in that draft, okay? Terrell Edmonds, James Washington, Mason Rudolph. That is how the Steelers went 1, 2, 3. And then I'm pretty sure they followed that one up with Chuks Okorafor, if I'm not wrong. I'm pretty sure that Chuks, or was that the year before?
I think that was the year after. That was when that happened.
The year after. Okay, so the top 3 picks there were Terrell Edmonds, James Washington, who might not even be on a team right now, and Mason Rudolph. And I don't know, Chuks was that year. Was that year.
This is an all-time Island of Misfit Toys right here. This is...
Yeah. I mean, Fred Warner's drafted in the 3rd round, 5 picks after James Washington goes. You look at, Mark Andrews is drafted in the 3rd round that year. Orlando Brown is drafted in the 3rd round that year. You could go as bad as Jordan Atkins is in there, and you could say what you want about him, but there are so many names in this draft that the Steelers just,
There's always a lot of it's hypothetical, or it's it's hindsight's 2020, and I'm Yeah, I understand that. I understand that aspect. But when I literally saw like the opportunity there, it still frustrates me. If it's something I didn't see, it doesn't frustrate me as much, but it's still something, it's like you got to hold the staff accountable. Like,
Yes.
I I just don't it frustrates me that that draft happened because that was the turning point. And that's why Baltimore is where they are. And that's why Pittsburgh is a team that thinks they're good, but they're not.
Yep, exactly. You look at every single year for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You look at the draft and go, dang, Baltimore had a good draft. Cincy had a good draft. Steelers had a terrible draft. That's just the general consensus. And sometimes I'm glad that this conversation went the way it did because, we came in here talking about the culture and is the culture dead with probably a firm grasp on the culture. Maybe it didn't even exist. Maybe that's not the way that the conversation should go. And I was glad that we got to bring it to a point where sometimes, man, you just make enough bad decisions that it comes back and it can't work out. And you could blame the locker room all you want. You could blame this all you want. The real reason that the Pittsburgh Steelers are bad is because they've done minimal good things in the last 5+ years to try and rectify their wrongs. That's just where they are. And with that said, we head into week 15. So we'll turn our attention to the game. If everybody got all their thoughts out on the Steelers culture.
Is that allowed? Are we allowed to talk football? Is that I don't think that's
the next. I think that's the next part of the process here. I think the Steelers turn their attention to week 15 and, hopefully George Pickens catches a couple more passes and they don't utilize their bad plays here. And I'd like to point out before we move on that we're talking about that draft class. Of all the guys that they did draft that year, Terrell Edmonds was probably the best, although he was really bad. The only two that they kept around were Mason Rudolph and Chuks Okorafor. And that just adds to the alarming, what the hell were you doing, that they just put together. And meanwhile, the 2017 draft, that's an even better point. They paid Chuks Okorafor and Mason. They didn't pay Mason, but they paid Chuks Okorafor. He's the only one outside of TJ Watt in those two drafts, 17 and 18, that the Steelers decided to keep long-term. Those two drafts, the 2017, James Conner is killing it over in Arizona. Cam Sutton, we all could acknowledge very quickly that was a bad move, that you shouldn't have got rid of Cam Sutton. You should never have let that guy walk. Mike Hilton showed up that year, I'm pretty positive, as an undrafted free agent, and you let him walk. You just said, yeah, whatever. What's he doing? Oh, he's just killing it in Cincinnati. No big deal. You let all these great pieces come, and the one that you decided to keep and sign to a long-term deal was Chuks Okorafor. So, shout out Pittsburgh Steelers. Just a good way to wrap that one up.